before I start my formal introduction, but you are in the right place and we'll get going very soon. Okay, good. Welcome everyone. I can't see you due to the webinar model, but it's wonderful to have so many of you there. I think there are 300, more than 300 of us out there in the ether coming together tonight. As I said just before, my name is Rick Millington. I'm a professor in the English department at Smith, where I teach American literature. It's my happy task to welcome all of you to this event, to thank the Friends of the Smith College Libraries, the sponsor, for bringing us together for this great and celebratory moment, and also thank my own department, the English department, for pitching in as a delighted co-sponsor. Tonight, we'll have an opportunity to hear about and to celebrate Melissa Homestead's The Only Wonderful Things, the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, a book just published by Oxford University Press. There's no book since the publication of Cather's selected letters several years ago more eagerly awaited in the world of Cather scholarship than this one. Those of us who work on Cather know from glimpses along the way that it will transform our understanding of Cather's development and accomplishment as a writer, and that it will resonate beyond the confines even of her capacious career, deepening our understanding of women's identities and cultures in the first half of the 20th century, complicating still prevalent romantic conceptions of authorship. If I may put it this way, this is a book with Smith written all over it. We discover the ambitious and urbane life of one Smith alum, Edith Lewis, class of 1902, via the indefatigable research and vivid writing of another alum, Melissa Homestead, class of 1985, with the invaluable assistance of a third, Bethanne Patrick, also class of 1985, who will interview Melissa about the book this evening. It's my job to introduce the latter two of you, to you all. I'll leave Edith Lewis to Melissa as a way of kicking off this evening's proceedings. But let me remain in the local domain long enough to say one more thing. This is a great night for the Smith English department, and it makes us very proud to have this occasion to learn from these two spectacularly accomplished alumni. So I'll introduce Melissa first. I wish that I could claim to have had a hand in contributing to Melissa Homestead's brilliant career by having taught her in a class, say, or having introduced her to Willa Cather's writing. But alas, that doesn't seem to comport with the historical record. I was arriving at Smith, more or less, as Melissa was more or less leaving, Bethanne too. I hasten to add that those two developments were related only chronologically, not causally. Happily, though, some overlap in our scholarly interests has put me in a good position to witness her scholarly career unfold. In effect, Melissa has had two distinguished careers which continue to unfold simultaneously. Through her work, recovering and interpreting the writing of 19th century American women authors, writers like Catherine Maria Sedgwick, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Fanny Fern, and E.D.E.N. Southworth, and the publishing world in which they operated, she has played an important role in the expansion and transformation of the canon of 19th century American literature. And that in itself is one of the most significant developments in American literary study during the past several decades. Her work on these writers has found expression in a very important book on women writers and literary property, in many articles, and in key editions of works neglected or nearly lost from view. Melissa's life as a Cather scholar, her second distinguished career, began with her Smith Honors thesis on Cather as a lesbian author. After a hiatus, she took time out, as I've mentioned, to shake up 19th century American literary study. She returned to Cather's writing, bringing to it the kind of careful attention to the economic and social worlds that books live within that one saw also in her earlier work. That enterprise grows into and culminates in the deeply researched, discovery-filled book that we'll hear about today. It is this body of work on Willa Cather that has brought Melissa to her current professional locations as professor of English and program faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Cather's alma mater, as director of that university's Cather Project, the indispensable engine room of Cather scholarship, and as associate editor of the Complete Letters of Willa Cather, a digital edition. If Melissa Homestead's work situates us in the distinctive historical worlds in which books came to life, her classmate Bethanne Patrick's career unfolds in the place where books live now. She has an influential presence as a writer of book reviews and author profiles for the Washington Post, where she also writes a monthly column on hot books. Her reviews have appeared in an array of other venues too, including the LA Times and NPR Books. And she writes a monthly column, Books You May Have Missed, sounds kind of crucial, right? For the online site LitHub. She has authored 2 books herself for National Geographic, is the editor of the anthology, The Books That Changed My Life, and is at work on a memoir for Counterpoint Press. She supports the book world, or has supported our book world in another way by serving as a member of the executive committee of the Friends of the Smith College Libraries. She also supports practicing writers through her work on the board of Penn Faulkner, and she helps new writers find their way through her work as a manuscript consultant. Most striking to me is the brilliant way she has deployed new media on behalf of all of us who love that time-honored, physically present, utterly irreplaceable piece of technology known as the hard copy book. We see this wonderfully generative versatility in Bethanne's author interviews. We'll get a sample tonight, in her lively Facebook presence, in her blog, and most spectacularly, I think, on Twitter, where, as the book maven, she keeps over 200,000, right? That's a number we don't think about in academic publishing, right? Followers appraised of what's new and exciting in the world of writing. So here's the drill for our joint activity this evening. Melissa will start us out with a brief overview of the book, including some images. Then Bethanne, as our master interlocutor, will join her for a conversation about this work. And we'll finish with time for some questions from the audience. Those questions should be delivered in writing via your Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Bethanne, in her practice professional capacity, will field those questions and relay them to Melissa. And that's how we'll close out the evening. We'll certainly consume the time that takes us to 8 o'clock, but Melissa and Bethanne are happy to stick around longer, and we'll keep questioning open till 8:30. Okay, so Melissa.
So good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be presenting virtually in this webinar sponsored by the Friends of the Smith College Libraries and the Smith English Department from my kitchen table in Lincoln, Nebraska. Before Bethanne Patrick, fellow member of the class of 1985, begins interviewing me about my book, I'm going to give a brief overview of it chapter by chapter, accompanied by images and followed by some special Smith College related content. So let me get my images up and running here. Okay, so there are two strands of argument throughout my book, signaled in my title by the phrase creative partnership. First, that is, two ambitious career women, Cather and Lewis, created a romantic and domestic partnership that allowed them to enjoy love and intimacy and pursue their ambitions. Second, that as an editor, Lewis was a partner in Cather's creative process and also used her expertise in advertising to help Cather craft Cather's image as an author. And this is a page from Cather's novel, The Professor's House, and all that handwriting is Edith Lewis's. And I've got a cat licking my hand. Anyway, my book starts and ends, oh, she got down, at the old burying ground in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where Cather and Lewis are buried side by side. I hope that by the end of the book, I've succeeded in undoing the mythology about the gravesite that has obscured Lewis's place in Cather's life. Having started at the end with my own first visit to Jaffrey in the autumn of 1984, Mountain Day, my senior year, I turned the clock back, introducing Edith Lewis as the young woman Willa Cather first met in Lincoln, Nebraska in August 1903 at the home of Sarah Harris, publisher of the Lincoln Courier. This is the Harris house, which is still standing in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's Sarah Harris's mother and brother, I believe, who are standing there, but this picture was taken in 1903 when the house was new, and Willa Cather and Edith Lewis met there. Delving briefly into Lewis's New England family history, which stretches as far back as the Mayflower, I paint a picture of her family's life in Nebraska before she herself emerged into public view. Oops, wait a second, go back. Emerged into public view as an adolescent, studying at the University of Nebraska and publishing short stories in the Lincoln Courier. That's her with her sorority at the University of Nebraska on the lower right. She transferred to Smith, where she met Oxa Barlow, an important character in the book, and I'll return to her later, and from which she graduated in 1902. Here she is with her literary society in the back row. Chapter 2 follows Lewis to New York City, where she moved after a year back in Lincoln teaching school. And this is 60 Washington Square, where she lived in a rooming house, is on the left with the curved lintel over the door. And it was practically a post-grad Smith College dorm. There were several other smithies in the building. And Willa Cather then actually moved into that building for a time later. I traced the growth of her relationship with Cather, both personal and professional, from their first meeting in 1903 through about 1918. From 1906, both Cather and Lewis worked at McClure's magazine, and I argued that the magazine office was the crucible of their collaborative work later on Cather's fiction. This is actually a poem published in McClure's as edited by Edith Lewis for McClure's magazine in red pen. I also argue that Cather and Lewis, in choosing to make a home together in 1908, and this is the building off of Washington Square where they rented then, were emulating Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, identified by most scholars as the prototypical Boston marriage. Sarah Orne Jewett was a novelist and author, and Cather met her in 1908, which turned out to be a year before she died. In any event, after Cather left McClure's, Lewis moved on to Every Week magazine, and I recover Lewis's work as an editor of fiction there. The image on the right may be familiar to some of you. It's an illustration by W.T. Benda from My Antonia of Lena Lingard, a Swedish immigrant, knitting while she's watching her family's cattle. On the left is a story that was published in Every Week magazine with Edith Lewis being the commissioning editor. And she also commissioned W.T. Benda to use the same model at the same time to make an illustration for this story. So the two of them, you can see their work is cross-fertilizing. In chapter 3, I turn the clock back to 1915 to tell the story of Cather and Lewis's 4 shared trips to the US Southwest. This is the two of them at Mesa Verde at Cliff Palace then. Throughout the book, Lewis's editing of Cather's fiction is a key theme, but I linger over the evidence here because the first surviving edited type draft of Cather's fiction is The Professor's House. And that's, again, is another page from The Professor's House, edited by Edith Lewis, which was grounded in their 1915 and 1916 travels in the Southwest. And this is a map that Edith Lewis drew that was important source material for The Professor's House. Their Southwestern travels in 1925 and 1926 inspired Death Comes for the Archbishop. Here they are in 1925 on horseback. Although there's no type draft of this novel, there's a rich record of their travel and literary collaboration. After mining the record of their experiences together in the desert Southwest, I focus in chapter 4 on Lewis's career as an advertising copywriter at the J. Walter Thompson Company, arguing that her advertising copy for soap and hand lotion and Cather's fiction are in conversation with each other. This is actually a Cather story published in a women's magazine, The Woman's Home Companion, right next to advertisement for Jergens lotion that Edith Lewis wrote the copy for. I also hypothesized that Lewis was behind the famous Edward Steichen portrait of Cather published in Vanity Fair. So Lewis worked extensively with Steichen, and she was responsible for Steichen both taking this picture, I argue, you can see Willa Cather says Steichen underneath, and for having Steichen photograph these women's hands kneading bread, again, for Jergens lotion. Lewis started in advertising in 1919, and she and Cather first summered on Grand Manan Island in 1922. I devote a separate chapter to their many summers there, both before and after they built their own cottage at Whale Cove. And here's a little photograph of the cottage that Edith Lewis tinted with watercolor, and Willa Cather wrote at the top, "This is our little home." Cather has often been portrayed as living in isolation on Grand Manan Island, but she was living with Lewis, who was actually the legal owner of the land and the cottage. Furthermore, at Whale Cove, they were part of a community of women and only women, and the place was lousy with Smith graduates and faculty, actually. In this chapter, I focus both on their collaborative work on the stories collected in the volume Obscure Destinies, published in 1932, and this is, again, Edith Lewis editing Willa Cather, a story, Two Friends, and on how both of them responded to the deaths of their parents in the late 20s and early 30s. I also see them as moving past grief in the 1930s by inviting sisters and nieces to visit them on the island. This is Willa Cather on Grand Manan with her niece, Mary Virginia Auld, class of 1929. In my last full chapter, I take them back to New York, where they lived, where they settled in a large apartment at 570 Park Avenue in 1932. In 1927, they had lost their Greenwich Village apartment to subway construction and camped out in a hotel for 5 years before leasing another apartment. They made their lives together there and built relationships with each other's families and with the Menuhin family. So that's Yehudi Menuhin, you may know, and then also his sisters, Hepzibah and Yalta, were musicians, and their parents, Maritha and Moshe. Both of them also died in this apartment 25 years apart. Appropriately, Lewis's profound grief at Cather's death occupies a significant portion of this final chapter. The years after Cather's 1947 death correspond to the Cold War panic over homosexuality, called by one historian the Lavender Scare. In my epilogue, I consider how this context enabled some to deny Cather's lesbian sexuality and to refuse to see Lewis for what she was and what she had been in Cather's life. And now for the special Smith College content. Although my book is a love story featuring Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, there's a parallel, sometimes submerged story running alongside of it. A classic Smith College story of roommates who became lifelong friends. Most of the evidence of Edith Lewis's long friendship with Oxa Barlow, later Brewster, is preserved in letters to Lewis from Oxa and also Oxa's husband, Earl, expatriate painters. After their 1910 marriage, they lived in Italy, France, and then India. Lewis spent times in Europe, although her extreme seasickness made visiting them in India impossible. And during their one return visit to the US in 1923, they stayed with Lewis in Greenwich Village in the apartment that she and Cather shared, although Cather was in Europe at the time. Lewis's first visit to Italy in 1914 was magical. There she is on the left on the beach in the vintage bathing costume. Oxa is sitting next to her, Earl is on the right, and one of their painter friends is in the middle. All of them recurred to this again and again over ensuing decades. Meeting Oxa's one child, Harwood, when she was a toddler, Lewis developed a strong bond with her. On an excursion to Capri, this is 1914 again, here they are at Capri, Lewis developed Oxa's first night away from her daughter. The two women, quote, talked over all the girls in our class at Smith and why they did as they did and admired everything altogether and loved it all tremendously. There's also, so much detail in Earl and Oxa's letters to Edith Lewis that didn't make it into my main storyline. For example, Edith evidently wrote Oxa about Willa Cather's menstrual cramps. Oxa responded by recommending sea bathing as a remedy. And when Harwood, married and a young mother, moved to the Boston area, an event announced by her mother in the Smith Alumni Quarterly, two of Edith and Oxa's classmates, Ruth Hawthorne French and Blanche Wyckoff Hull, appeared at Harwood's doorstep to see how she was doing. There are hints that Lewis became a quasi-daughter and sister of the Barlow family. Her parents and younger siblings were far away in Nebraska, but the Barlows, including Oxa's two older sisters, Lola and Alpha, also Smith graduates, were in New Haven. I imagine they took the Western stranger into their home on holidays. And one touching detail tells me how Alpha and Lola understood the profound significance of the friendship between their sister and Edith Lewis. When the news of Oxa's death in February 1942 reached them, Alpha took the train to New York City to tell Edith in person. I wish I knew more about Lewis's other college friendships. Recently, I was reminded of a document I forgot I had, so this is not in the book. Notes Lewis scribbled in a book she bought at the beginning of her senior year, The Essays of St. Beuve in translation. In one section, she names the classmates who were her dates, as it were, for each of the events of her commencement weekend in 1902. There's Ruth French, whom I just mentioned. Their fathers were Dartmouth classmates, and they were fellow officers of a literary society. And others who are already named in the book are also on this list. I'm surprised that Oxa is not among them. And I'm intrigued by Lucy Wicker being her Ivy Day companion. Did she keep up these friendships after graduation? I don't know. Lucy Wicker lived in New York with her father. The concrete traces of Lewis's life at Smith and the college archives are scant, right? So here is the index card kept by her class secretary that plays a role in my introduction. There's also her transcript and the records of her literary society. Nevertheless, these scant traces allowed me to begin my reconstruction of Lewis's life. This book is also the product of another kind of love story, my love affair with Smith College libraries and especially the college archives. This is me for my 30th reunion. Audrey Procaccini Anderson, who was taking pictures for our class the whole time, took a picture of me doing this. Every time I go into this, every time I visit Smith, which I do a ridiculous number of times, I go sit in the stacks and pull the Cather books off the shelf and just hold them and stroke them. This is my Antonia in the library copy. Those of you who attended Smith in the early 1980s may remember that round of library construction, a vigorous fundraising effort by early alumni of the college financed construction of the alumni gym. This is a 1901 basketball game. Lewis was not on a basketball team, but she was almost certainly one of the young women there sitting up on the running track with their legs dangling over. In the late 1970s, the college announced plans to demolish the building as part of a Nielsen Library renovation, but alumni protested and the building was saved. When the gym reopened as the home of the college archives and the Sophia Smith collection, and that happened, I think, in '83, I spent many afternoons just hanging out in the reading room, browsing feminist academic journals and reading through old yearbooks and issues of the Sophian. I miss the old reading room, but I understand why it wasn't suitable for preservation and access of the collections. And I look forward to visiting the new special collection space sometime soon. And I'm pretty sure Nancy Young, the college archivist, is here. I also talk in my introduction about buying this copy of Willa Cather Living, Edith Lewis's memoir of Cather, inscribed to Mary Virginia Auld, later Mellon, Willa Cather's niece, that I picked up for 50 cents at the Smith Library book sale in 1983. And I told Nancy when I was done with my book that I would actually give it back to special collections. It should not have been discarded when Mary Virginia died and donated her Cather books to the college library. And I will also just say a little self-promotion here that if people are interested in buying my book and you don't want to give Jeff Bezos all your money, you can find a link on my website and a discount code to buy it directly from Oxford University Press. So, all right, ready for Bethanne to come in.
And I am here. I think I'm here.
Ooh. There we go.
Here we go. Hello, hello. So delighted to be here, Melissa. This is such a great way of reconnecting, how many years after commencement. So I think I've got a lot of questions about the book, but I do know also that there's going to be a lot of questions from our audience. So I will try to be as pithy as possible in acting as your interlocutor this evening. But thank you to the Friends of the Smith College Libraries. Thank you to the Smith College Department of English. And thank you to all of you who are helping today. And Rick, I want to say thanks for that splendid introduction for us both. That was really lovely. Melissa, thank you for that introduction to your book. And I have been fortunate enough to read the entire thing and see all of the photos. But the characters of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, to me, I feel like they would be fantastic to have here with us this evening, but they also would be anyone's ideal Smith contemporaries. They're intelligent, sophisticated, curious about the world. I just want to spend time with them after reading The Only Wonderful Things. I imagine that would be something you would really want too.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Willa Cather might be a little forbidding. Particularly if she were coming here in her, full, adult celebrity incarnation.
Author.
Yes, author and someone with very strong opinions. I think Edith Lewis would, of all the little bits and pieces I found out about her from records with people who had no particular interest in Willa Cather, she was shy, a little reserved, but she was also determined. I think of people I know who are very shy, but nevertheless are university professors. So that kind of managed shyness. But she also had very strong opinions too. And she was, particularly in writing, I think she was a master of the business letter, and I was a paralegal for a time, so I understand what's involved in those.
Yes.
But she starts off with the sort of, praise or self-effacement, then she goes in for the hard news in the middle and answers all the questions and says the things, and then she sort of goes out again with the soft touch. But
sorry, she was very careful. And one of the things I want to bring up about that card in the alumni directory that you showed of Edith Lappery. Sorry, Edith Lappery.
It actually gets misrepresented, like in the yearbook and stuff. People are always getting her name.
It does. Yeah. It's a great name though. And so there was a clue on that card that you and I discussed before this evening, which says Willa Cather Companion. And then outside of the parens, is that correct? It says not for publication. And what you finally discerned, which I think is fascinating, is that, in other words, Willa Cather was saying, look, yes, Edith, let them know that you and I are companions, but I don't want to have all the publicity around this.
Well, this is actually, I don't think that note was not Edith Lewis's doing. That note came from Oxa. Because Oxa wrote, it's pretty clear to me that she wrote to the class secretary about Edith Lewis and Willa Cather having visited the summer before, having visited in France. They were living at that point. And, Oxa said, oh, don't put the part about Miss Cather in the note, in the quarterly. But it was still something. Yeah, right. So, but it was also, this is one of the relationships that they had where they were both parts of a couple, and they were treated as a couple by other couples, right? So Oxa and Earl clearly understood them as a couple, although that friendship was much more grounded in Edith Lewis. It also extended to Willa Cather. And I think her brother Roscoe and his wife Meta, that also became a relationship where they were sort of couples together. So Mabel Lujan and her husband, Tony Lujan. So there were these, straight couples who understood them as couples, and Oxa and Earl they were sort of one part of that.
Well, this is actually makes me skip down a few questions, because one of the things that I think is really interesting is how differently things were perceived at that time in the teens, 20s, and 30s of the 20th century. You and I had been discussing how there wasn't such a thing as coming out the way in the 1980s, 1990s, people might have understood it. At the same time, there was a great deal of understanding among friends and relations of not just Cather and Lewis, but of other, you mentioned Sarah Orne Jewett, for example, and the idea of the Boston marriage. And so this was something that was really accepted, but it was accepted under the guidelines of a certain kind of society. And of course, we don't have that society anymore. But at the same time, I think in The Only Wonderful Things, you illustrate so beautifully how this all worked together, how they had these friends, some of them straight, some of them not. And so would you comment on that, what it meant to look at two women in a very deep relationship, romantic, personal, professional, who were accepted by so many in their circle and didn't have to explain themselves?
Well, I mean, this is actually my argument and an intervention in scholarship to present them that way. This is not always the story that you see. I'm relying
absolutely.
Yeah. So in fact, Cather is often presented in, queer literary history as the rise of the closet. Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields are the Boston marriage, but then that's no longer possible. And then you have Cather feeling, shame, being obsessed with privacy. These are all the things that you will find in scholarship, including scholarship that's very centered in queer identities, right? But I think that a lot of that has been based on other biographical work where Edith Lewis is basically invisible. So here she is. If you put her into the picture, Willa Cather no longer looks like she's living in isolation. She doesn't look like she's preoccupied with shame and hiding. You do have, though, this kind of interesting dynamic where I think for some of the couples, like Earl and Oxa, I mean, I think that this was, that Edith and Oxa were very, very close. And so I think that there were real conversations about her relationship with Willa Cather. That would be my sense. Now, if you look at, say, some of Willa Cather's family and Edith Lewis's family, I think it was more very tacit, right? You just didn't have to name. As long as you did not name, you could accept and function. So which is different from some other figures that you might see. I think a lot of people would think of, say, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas there in Paris. That's a different kind of couple. But this is really say, okay, like what other cases haven't we seen? How might Willa Cather and Edith Lewis make this period look different? And I think it really is this kind of not naming, but still not hiding that we see.
Well, it's really interesting because there's been resistance, as you say, from different factions about the importance of the relationship between Cather and Lewis. And they were companions for 39 years, which is about 38 years longer than most Hollywood marriages. And so people are still shying away from calling them partners, acknowledging that they were truly enmeshed. And as you and I said the other day, I mean, I'm sorry to be so blunt, but who really cares about the sex? I mean, we do, but the most important thing is that they built a life together.
Right. I mean, there still are some people in Cather world, and I bet Rick could guess who would say there's no, in fact, there's one particular person who, no matter how many times I try to correct him, he says, oh, I got cat hair all over me, sorry. He says, there's no evidence for that accusation that Willa Cather was a lesbian. To which I just have to say, come on. But also, questions of evidence, people aren't looking for questions of evidence for a lot of other relationships. So I think the idea that you're going to find evidence of particular, say, sex acts, for example, like, why is that necessary? It's not that if it existed, it would be something to talk about, but you don't have that for straight married couples often, right? So, and so but they're just there, right? They're definitely there together. And there is no, Willa Cather doesn't have some male friend who she has, escort her to public functions or something like that. There's no games going on.
We'll talk briefly towards the end about the idea of even that. But one of the things that I think is really important is, as I said, they had a shared life. They built a life together. They lived together. They worked together. They owned property together. They traveled together. They mourned family and friends together. This is much more important. There are many, you just mentioned straight marriages. There are a lot of straight marriages where there's no sex going on at all, right? So who cares about the sex again? But the shared life, the part that really, really struck me from your book is the living in community and the traveling, because especially in the 20s and 30s, the places that Lewis and Cather were traveling together weren't always easy to get to. They, sometimes it took a lot of effort to make a long train trip or to take a long, car trip, etc. So I want to talk primarily, for time's sake, because there's so many places they went, about New Mexico and then Grand Manan, which are both so fascinating, not just to Cather's work, but to the relationship, I think, as well. So New Mexico is a place where Cather, my favorite Willa Cather is Death Comes for the Archbishop. And that is a matter of taste purely, but that's exactly, I've never even been to New Mexico. I know very little about it, but anything I know comes from that novel. So tell me about their travels there and how that deepened their connection.
Well, they went to New Mexico in 1915 and 16, as well as 1925 and 26.
Mhm.
And on all of those trips really informed their informed work also on The Professor's House, and which was published in 25, and then Death Comes to the Archbishop in 27. And a lot of what really happened is they are imagining themselves in history, and they are imagining themselves in history across gender. So they're playing cowboy when they go to Mesa Verde, which is actually in Colorado, but just across from New Mexico. And they're playing missionary priests, the dual protagonists of Death Comes for the Archbishop, when they're in New Mexico. And I think for me, the thing that's so interesting is just in both of those instances, the pleasure in their experiences informs the work of fiction. That you just sort of get their experiences of place are translated into the experiences of these characters. And that Edith Lewis, so for The Professor's House, I joked that a third of my book is actually about The Professor's House, because that typescript with all of Edith Lewis's handwriting is amazing. But also then, so you don't have that for Death Comes for the Archbishop, but there are, research notes and all sorts of things, and just their experiences also in 1926 when they go there. Cather's brother Roscoe brings his family down from Wyoming, and that just really becomes a bonding experience, the sort of family experience. And one of the other things that I was thinking about, things I didn't write about that I couldn't have, was that second trip in 1926. They had been there for about a week together. They were staying at the La Fonda and touring around with Mary Austin's niece, who had a car and could drive. And then Roscoe and his family arrive. And the day that Roscoe and his family arrive, Edith Lewis found out that her father died in California. And I mentioned that in another chapter, but I just thought how there's no way she was going to get to New Hampshire in the middle of her vacation. His coffin probably went through New Mexico on the way, then back to his family plot in Claremont, New Hampshire. And I just thought how profoundly sad she must have been, because his life had been very sad after he left Nebraska.
Yes.
And they didn't even think actually too about, the book ending with the Archbishop's death, and the death of his fellow priest that comes first. And I'm thinking about how all of that sort of might have worked its way into the book. But also I can just imagine, Willa Cather's brother and his family trying to cheer her, as she was probably weepy, right?
Yes.
She was probably, she was enjoying driving around the countryside with them, but she was also probably, she would have been profoundly sad.
She would have been profoundly sad. And, Grand Manan in Canada, which is, it's such a different place than New Mexico, but it was also intensely important to both women. And it's also, the reason I wanted to bring it up is because some sadness is conveyed to them while they're there, which you can talk about. but it is also where Cather wrote a story that happens to be your favorite work. Maybe not your only favorite, but
yeah.
I wanted to talk about Old Mrs. Harris, and not just about Old Mrs. Harris and where it might come from in that shared mourning for family members, but also Edith Lewis's role in its editing, which I think is quite significant.
Yeah. So, in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, both of them lost both of their parents, from 1926 to 1931, in that period of time. And I think, and then later, Willa Cather's brother died, and she was there sort of recovering from that in the late 1930s. But I think that the place, it was a home, and it was a home, in fact, while they had no settled home in New York.
Right.
And in part, they had no settled home in New York because both of them, Edith Lewis spent a year hopping the train from New York up to Springfield every weekend to visit as her mother slowly died away from having had a massive stroke. Whereas Willa Cather spent, she had to go, it was a longer distance, so she would go for a couple of months at a time to Pasadena, where her mother kind of got stranded when she was visiting her brother out in California, and was in a sanitarium, and was even practically suffering from locked-in syndrome for years. So they were both having this experience in New York of being frazzled, of being always away. And then they would go to Grand Manan, where they had their little home, right? They built their little home, started building it in 26, first occupied it in 28. And Old Mrs. Harris is a story based on Cather's family very closely. And the title character is based on her grandmother. And then there's, mother and father in the family. And then there's Victoria Templeton corresponds to Cather herself, and the other children in the household correspond to her brothers and sisters. And so it's just, it's a complicated story about a family having a lot of internal conflict, and a woman at the center of the story who is having, Old Mrs. Harris is being ignored. She's kind of starting to die, and everybody's ignoring the grandmother who does all the work. And then there's the mother, Victoria Templeton, who is feeling very conflicted. She just found out she's pregnant again. Her husband's kind of a failure. They're crammed in this little house, and Cather was writing this in the middle of writing the story, which is a lot about her mother and her imagining her mother. And the daughter doesn't appreciate either her grandmother or understand her mother, right? So Cather herself is the blithe adolescent. And so she's writing this story where she's imagining in really deep ways the experiences of her mother and her grandmother. And then her mother, she finds out while she's working on this that her mother dies. And she can't get back. So her mother's going to be shipped from California back to Nebraska to be buried. And there's just no way that she can actually get there in time. And so she stays, and she's sort of fumbling. But a lot of what Edith Lewis does with that story, what she does with most of Cather's fiction, is Cather had these public pronouncements about, cutting away things and working for the aura, for the emotional quality, and not being so explicit. To let readers imagine, to feel it, as opposed to laying everything out on the page, right? That's Cather's proclaimed aesthetic.
Genius. Yeah, exactly.
Right, but it's also, she writes essays where she says this, right?
Right.
And a lot of what Edith Lewis is doing, I think, is holding her to her own aesthetic program. And she's taking out things that are too obvious, that are a little too harsh, because she knows what the stakes are, and she knows people in the family are still alive who might be offended. So the story still cuts pretty deep, but it's much more muted than when Cather was, writing it.
Well, and I also imagine that Lewis's professional writing, I mean, you have to be so concise and so intense in copywriting. And she must have brought that eye onto Cather's work, which is, again, this is something that you are doing in The Only Wonderful Things and in all of your Cather scholarship that actually makes a difference in how we interpret the way that Cather wrote. For example, I'm not going to get, it was at the professor's house where Edith claimed at one point that she wrote a chapter.
No, it's Shadows on the Rock.
Shadows on the Rock.
Right,
Shadows
right.
on the Rock. And, that is not documented. We're not sure if that's true. However, what is true to me as a writer who is married is that the person you live with, and whether it's your spouse, your critique partner, a trusted colleague, these people can make a big difference to your writing. And so Lewis, it seems to me, regardless of anything else, has to be thought of as, and I hate the word amanuensis, she has to be thought of as not an amanuensis, but as a collaborator. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. No, she is an editorial collaborator. I wouldn't say co-author, that would be going too far, but yeah, amanuensis, literary assistant taking dictation. Nope.
Nobody, no typing, while the great person, writes and,
She couldn't type. I seriously think that she got out of college and was like, all right, if I learn to type, I'm going to be a secretary and I'm not going to learn to type. And there are actually, when I look through all of the personnel files of all the female employees of the J. Walter Thompson Company in their archive, which I did. I mean, there was one woman, Stanley Reeser, the chairman of the firm. His secretary had a law degree, although they were bachelor's degrees at that point, and an MBA. And she was his secretary. Yeah. There were women with graduate degrees put into the secretarial pool. And so I think that Lewis was just very, very careful and
very smart. I
decided not to learn to type.
I don't know if anyone who graduates from Smith still goes to Catherine Fields,
Katie Gibbs is gone.
Katie Gibbs. But I know we had classmates who did. I know we, knew contemporaries who did. And I remember making a very firm decision to say, oh, if I learn that, I may just go ahead and, the rest is history. But speaking of history, we have been talking about it, and I want to get to these questions. I do have a couple more that I can, put in if we've got some more time, but I want to make sure that those who have been following along get a chance. One thing I know I can answer briefly, but then we'll flip over to you, Melissa, is Elaine Bennett says, why are so many pictures of them separate rather than together? Was it the limitations of contemporary photography or a choice of theirs to hide their relationship? And so that one, thank you so much, Elaine. Definitely, I know there is an answer to. So,
well, okay, there's a difference between the pictures that survive and all of the pictures that may have existed. And there are complicated questions about who may have, there's a long story about what happens after Edith Lewis dies, and other people who may have destroyed objects. But the answer is that they were off in the wilderness alone together, and they just handed the camera back and forth. And those happened to be the pictures that survived. The one picture of them together was in a master's thesis by someone who did a master's thesis on Cather in the New England and New Brunswick. Did this at the University of New Brunswick, and he found someone who had this picture, and it was like pasted into his master's thesis, and I found it there. So there probably may even be more pictures. I just don't know. But the real answer is that if you're out in the wilderness together and there's nobody else, you hand the camera back and forth. In fact, on the pictures of them on horseback, you can see that the horizon lines go in different directions. So it was like, you take a picture of me and Edith Lewis, there's more than one picture. Cather, there's some great letters where Cather writes to one of her brothers in 1915 or 1916 and says that, oh, they're great horses. I at least managed to get by, but Edith is a very showy rider. And you can just see anybody. I have a friend who was a competitive horsewoman as a teenager. And she's like, Edith is sitting that horse, right? And that's the phrasing in, equestrians, they sit a horse. And she is, right? She's got a crop, and Willa Cather is just, I'm on the horse.
I love that. The next question we've got from Meredith Morris is, what is the connection with Jaffrey, New Hampshire, which I know you can answer at length.
Okay, so the primary the first of the two of them to go to Jaffrey was Willa Cather. She went there first in 1917 and worked on My Antonia. So that was Isabel McClung, who she'd lived with in Pittsburgh, married a man, Jan Hamburg, and that was the year after Isabel and Jan married, and they invited her to go up to Jaffrey where they were renting a house. And then Edith Lewis also started going up there with Willa Cather, and they stayed in the Shattuck Inn. So that's how they came to love Jaffrey. I think the other thing for Edith Lewis that was important was that, you know, her father's family was from New Hampshire. And I think that sort of put her close to that family history. And her sisters attended the Sargent School for Physical Training to train as gym teachers. And they went to a summer camp that was right close by Jaffrey. So I think there are just a lot of connections up there. But it was just a beautiful place to go. Cather often went there herself because Edith was just too busy. She had a job. But
Right.
also, it was a place to escape like the heat, the sort of late summer heat in New York City. But yes, that's how they ended up in Jaffrey.
Jane Sherwin says, would you like to comment on the striking difference between the tombstones of Cather and Lewis? Is this purely Lewis's modesty? And I can say, no, it's not. Take it away, Melissa.
Okay, so when Edith Lewis died, she specified in her will that she wanted to be buried in her plot. She bought the plot in 1947 by the side of her friend Willa Cather, and she wanted no marker. And then about 5 years after she died, the selectmen of the town of Jaffrey petitioned to put a marker for Willa Cather's secretary. They got her birth year wrong. And it was placed because of cemetery regulations at the foot of Cather's grave. It was a foot marker. And then it was moved later because Edith Lewis's, it would be niece, found out about this and was like, the hell, we didn't put that there. Who put that there? And it was relocated up to next to Cather's stone. And then later it's been moved again. I mean, the whole thing here, though, is that Lewis said no marker, which could be a sign of her modesty, but also if you saw that picture of the grave, it's a beautiful semi-public memorial. It's a granite stone. Her friend
Yes.
Rudolf Ruzica, who was a typographer and engraver, helped her with the design. She didn't drive, so he and his wife took her up there and helped her with all of it. And according to cemetery regulations, you either have to have a foot marker or you have to engrave the information. If you put a second or third or whatever person into a plot, you have to engrave it on the stone. And so she would have had to violate the integrity of this beautiful memorial. And I don't think she wanted a foot marker either, because the foot marker is basically part of like the patriarchal model. Think of it, you know, the surname,
Right.
husband, wife, unmarried children. And I've had people say like, you know, shouldn't we dig Willa Cather up and, you know, reinter her in Nebraska? And I'm just like, you know, if you follow that logic, we'd all be buried in Mesopotamia, wouldn't we? I mean, like, does she belong to her parents because she didn't marry a man, right? I mean, that seems
Right.
to be the logic. And no, her partner chose the place and created a memorial and then chose to be buried there and chose something that, like I said, it's open to interpretation why she chose. And I end my book with my interpretation. But I think Lewis has been so often been ignored or mocked. If there is an opportunity for interpretation, I will always choose agency or pleasure. I will allow her agency or pleasure whenever I make a choice. And so that was, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I think this next one is a great one. Faith Hawkins, she, her, hers. Says, hi, Melissa. What are a few things about Lewis and Cather's creative partnership that surprised you?
What surprised me? You know, it was funny that, you know, I came into the project on the assumption that Lewis's work was substantive and constituted collaboration. Before I even looked at the typescripts, I was like, that's the only thing that would make sense, right? I heard about them and I thought that's the only thing that would make sense. And mostly it was how much material proved me right. I mean, that wasn't a surprise, but everything kind of supported what I was guessing based on my understanding of how authorship works. I mean, I'm a historian of authorship, right? So there really weren't surprises. It was more just finding more and more that confirmed, and the kind of pleasure of locating the work in time and place. So it wasn't a surprise. It was more for me pleasure. So when Edith Lewis is editing Two Friends, Another Story in Obscure Destinies, it's a story that's supposedly set in Kansas, but she just moves Red Cloud, Nebraska around to different places. It's Red Cloud, Nebraska. But the opening paragraph is basically like the Bay of Fundy, if you know. And I just realized that Willa Cather wrote it there and Edith Lewis was editing it there. And I guess maybe a little surprise is realizing that Cather was under deadline pressure and she was just bumbling and fumbling around because of her mother having died, and Edith Lewis just really took it and finished that project for her. I think the other thing, maybe a little bit of a surprise, there are a couple of duplicate documents, and there's been a sense that Edith Lewis must have been copying over things from a document to like preserve it. And I actually figured out that it went in the other direction. Willa Cather was copying over Edith Lewis's edits in order to save them, right? Because they were on Grand Manan Island and she was keeping the extra copy in case something got lost in the mail. And it was really, you can figure it out because Edith Lewis is crossing herself out, right? And then there's a copy where Willa Cather is just copying over the final version of the edits that Edith Lewis did. So
it's so satisfying to do this kind of research. I mean, it just from my very little experience doing the same thing, I can just feel it. I can hear it in your voice. I love that. And speaking of that, Mary Jean Corbett says,
"Oh, hey, Mary Jean, hi."
And we have an anonymous attendee who says, wondering at what point do academics today refer to these relationships not as companions, but as what they were, lovers or partners? Straight married couples don't have to justify their marriage or partnership today. How much sex they do or don't have, they don't have to do that. So why do we hold this couple to antiquated measures of what makes a valid relationship? I'm wondering, were they able to miss the pressure to have children by being in a lesbian relationship, or was that something they grappled with, or was it off the table completely for one or both of them? And I just want to interject, first of all, thank you, this is a great question, is that I definitely don't think that Melissa is trying to refer to them simply as companions, but definitely as lovers and partners. So I will let you go from there, Melissa.
Right. I mean, I'd say that the term companion is one that, and I still have people want to say companion. And the thing is that in the early 20th century, there was still this kind of like secretary / companion position that you would be like somebody's social secretary and handle all sorts of things for them. And so companion to me, puts it back into the realm of Edith Lewis's paid employee or subordinate. And so I definitely do not use the term companion. It is interesting. There are some others. So Willa Homestead, the opera singer, her actually sort of paid secretary and companion and lover, Mary Watkins. There are letters where Willa Cather refers to Mary Watkins as Willa Homestead's companion. So she was using that terminology. I would say that I have basically, so I think she might have been thinking about the index card, right? Where it says companion. And I think perhaps, Oxa Barlow Brewster said, oh, Edith Lewis and her companion, Willa Cather, visited us in France. Oh, don't put the part about Willa Cather in the note in the quarterly. And I think that term among her peers the women who had been her classmates in the late 19th and early 20th century, they would have known exactly what that meant. I don't think they would have known what partner meant, and I don't think they would have thought wife worked either, or spouse. So I think that for them to say companion meant exactly that they were romantic partners and committed partners, and that would have been legible to other people. But I don't choose to use that. I'd say that in terms of the way that they presented themselves, I don't see any definitional work in letters. It's just like, they just refer to each other, without explanation. And I imagine in lots of contexts, it was also, oh, this is Miss Lewis, there you go.
There you go. Margaret
No explanation,
Hunt,
yeah.
is here and says, listening to this conversation, I am wondering if the perspective of the Cather-Lewis relationship is perhaps healthier and happier than the intensity of today's coming out decisions. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I would say that, there's one thing that I did in my research when I was looking at all of the seniors who graduated from Hatfield House, which is where Edith Lewis lived. It wasn't a classroom building then, it was one of the residential houses. And at about that time, about 50% of Smith graduates married men. And the rest did not marry. I hate the phrase "did not marry." In fact, in the Willa Cather complete letters, part of our biographical annotation policy says the phrase "never married" will never appear in these biographical annotations. But I still think, though, that of the women who graduated from Hatfield House in 1902, only one married. So I don't think that there was a struggle. I think there was probably a natural progression. But I don't really know all that much about Edith Lewis's interior life at any point until after Cather dies. Then I actually know quite a bit because of the volume of letters and letters to her and things going on then. But my guess is that there was not for her a struggle. I think there was a deliberate decision not to take a conventional path to marriage. But I think having gone to Smith and her experience at Smith made that kind of logical. But she spent 1 year back in Nebraska at home teaching elementary school. And then I basically was like, hell no, getting out of here. And she moved to New York. I mean, it was a really gutsy thing to do. And it
was a really gutsy thing to do.
Yeah, even though she had all those friends who were already living at 60 Washington Square. It was practically, like I said, it was practically a Smith house. But yeah, no, she got adventurous. Yeah.
Do you know, Margaret Hunt asks, if Cather agreed with all of Lewis's editing?
There are of the different typescripts, like the Professor's House typescript, the particular state, and there was obviously earlier and then probably 2 later typescripts, and then also corrections on the galley proofs. But sometimes Willa Cather reversed Edith Lewis's editing. So there are many of these where they go back and forth multiple times. In particular, 2 friends, you can just see them going back and forth. And sometimes she reversed Edith Lewis, but sometimes Edith Lewis reversed Willa Cather and reverted back to what she had originally done. So there's there's a productive friction there. So yeah, but the Professor's House typescript, it's all Edith Lewis's editing. And there's a note in Cather's hand to her secretary, saying, Miss Bloom, please type 3 carbons, right? So there's no reverting of anything that Edith Lewis did on that typescript.
Which is really, really amazing when you think about it. It really is. It's a lot of trust there. Yeah. I love this one. I just wanted to make sure I get the name. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling up for a second. Oh, darn it. Elizabeth Crowell said, first of all, my mother wanted to go to Katie Gibbs after Smith. I know, mine did too. Secondly, I was interested in the meeting of D.H. Lawrence and Willa Cather. Is there any sense that Willa Cather felt minimized or dismissed by the white male writers of the time? And I just want to interject that, of course, that meeting is in your book. What did Lewis do to help promote Cather in the mega age of male modernism? Very possibly possibly D.H. Lawrence a tad overrated looking back on it. We're not even going to,
I gotta tell you, my junior year, my Glee Club seatmate in Alto 2, Melanie Gold, wrote her honors thesis, so she was a year ahead of me, on D.H. Lawrence, and I edited it for her, and then she persuaded me to take a whole seminar on D.H. Lawrence. I am still suffering from the trauma of reading nothing but D.H. Lawrence
really
for a semester.
PTSD from D.H. Lawrence, it's true.
So, but in any event, I mean, I think I actually really don't like Cather's literary politics. She was often dismissive of other women writers. She was very dismissive of her 19th century predecessors. So she, sometimes there is some sort of promotional copy that she had stuff to do with, where she is like with Edith Wharton, like the lonely eminence, the two women who rose above the meretricious trash that is the popular market. So I don't think in the 1930s she felt the kind of radical leftist critics went for her, particularly because she was writing historical fiction. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think she liked that, but she got a lot of respect in part by being the exceptional woman. And I know that Liz actually has the book and has been reading it, which is why she asked that question. And I do have to say that Willa Cather met D.H. Lawrence because of Edith Lewis, because Oxa and Earl were friends with D.H. Lawrence. And that's how that all happened. It was because of Edith Lewis's Smith College career that Willa Cather met D.H. Lawrence.
which is very interesting. And this next question, well, we might take, several hours on it, but so promise me you won't, Melissa. Okay, but Francesca Sawaya says,
well, Francesca, she's not a Smithy. Hi, Francesca.
What questions do you still have as a biographer that you wish you could answer about Lewis and Cather? I am assuming, Francesca.
Yes. I mean, it really is, so I found 600 of Edith Lewis's letters to various people, none to Cather, and only about 10% of them are dated before Cather's death. So I would really like to have more of her voice and to feel like I really have a firm sense of her interiority and subjectivity, because I don't really. I mean, I do sort of, but I have a much firmer grasp on Cather because just that huge body of material, all of her letters, we're up to, I think we're over 3,200 at this point. So there's just a lot of Cather, and there's a lot less of Lewis. And so,
you point out in the book, Melissa, that one of the reasons there aren't more letters between the two women is you write letters to people who live at a distance from you. You don't write letters to the person who's at the desk next to you. Right. It's really understandable. This is not, it's not a gap in scholarship or anything. It's just, I wish there were more.
Well, but not even between them. I'm just saying her letters to anybody.
Right.
And
exactly.
the problem is that she is not identifiable, so I mean, I did manage to find letters where she was corresponding with authors for Every Week magazine. I mean, Philip Curtis, he came in late, and those are great letters. But I'm sure there are many other letters, but they're just not collected, or she's in some collection, when the finding aid says correspondence L through M. And I just wouldn't even know she's in there, right? So there, I'm sure that there are many more letters to people who, and even just the letters to her. So there clearly she wrote many letters, and I would love to have, for instance, as clear that every year when she went to Grand Manan, she wrote really long letters to Earl and Oxa, which she didn't have time to do otherwise,
right? Because
they always respond to her Grand Manan letter, and they quote back parts of the letters sometimes, which was giving me little bits of it, so I get the fun things like, their cottage was menaced by rats one summer.
I would just love, this is totally an aside, but I wish someone would either write a full treatment of Oxa and Earl's marriage or write a historical novel about it, because it is really
Right. There is a book about Oxa and Earl and their friendship with Willa Cather, which barely mentions Edith Lewis.
Oh, we have got some more questions, and there are a couple that are very light, and so I just want to bring them up because they're also from delightful people. And so Audrey Anderson wants to know if they had basset hounds.
They didn't have any dogs or cats. I mean, it's clear that there are some, and Audrey took the picture of me in the Smith College Library stacks. They are, when Willa Cather went to France in 1923 and stayed with Jan and Isabel Hamburg, they had an Alsatian who had puppies. There's some great pictures of her, and there are great pictures of the puppies. There's a great dog in one story. There's a Boston Terrier in Coming Aphrodite, which is in Youth and the Bright Medusa. Caesar, he's one of the great dogs in literature. And there is a fabulous cat in Old Mrs. Harris. It's one of the Blue Boy. He's a big Persian, and he is a beautiful, beautiful cat. And he dies of distemper. It's kind of sad, but he is one of the great cats in literature. So I can recommend that.
I love that. I'm not going to forget Blue Boy now. I'm going to remember him. Jennifer Vaca says, and I love this because any of you who are classmates or friends of Melissa and follow her on social media know that Melissa loves donuts. So what kind of donut would honor this beautiful relationship? And Jennifer says this is just for giggles, but I'll tell you, I love Melissa's donut posts. And so, I mean, what would be,
so now I have no idea about donuts. I know that they were very big on candy. Not so much on baked goods. Cather is always getting people to send her candy and getting candy sent from Boston, from this Mary Elizabeth, this like little candy chain in Boston, getting candy shipped to Grand Manan Island. Very big on candy. They didn't drink beer. Cather liked Black Label whiskey, and they were very big on wine, but I'm just very disappointed that there is no sign that they liked beer.
Alas, no beer. That's really sad.
But what kind of donut? I just don't have a good sense on the baked goods. I think they would probably go more for French pâtissier. They liked fancy French restaurants in New York City as well as in France. I know they had chocolate cake in France.
I really wish, I know you say the last apartment was close to their favorite fancy French restaurant, Voisin. And I thought, where is this place? I want to go to there.
It's not, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was very, very fancy, very fancy.
So, I have a really good question from Amanda Mott, who says, you think Edith's experience in advertising and writing to a commercial market influenced the final manuscripts? And if so, how? And I think we've touched on that. Have some more to discuss.
Well, yes. I mean, I do think that she was practicing tradecraft. Because there's in The Professor's House, there's a moment when Godfrey St. Peter is editing Tom Outland's diary at the beginning, and he's talking about how beautiful the diary is for what it did not say. If words had cost money, right? He could not have been more economical in his expression. And that's actually a truism from advertising. Words do cost money when you're placing advertisements. But I also think it goes the other way. And I really feel like the people at the J. Walter Thompson Company who put her on the biggest, the biggest client, the most important client for the whole firm. She was the sole copywriter for the Juergens and the Woodbury's account, which were both Juergens Corporation. They knew that she was bringing skill from a magazine editor, and they knew that she lived with Willa Cather. So I also think she's bringing the literary sensibility to that. And that's what they valued. And that's why they put her on those accounts.
Absolutely. And Lois Thompson says, how much did the fact that Lewis went to Smith motivate you to write this book?
Oh, it's how I got myself into this mess. So anyway, so I have some fun objects here. Here is my master's thesis in the little snap binder. I don't know if Susan Van Dyne did manage to show up, but here's her report on my thesis that she was commissioned to do by the department to pass my thesis. And then, of course, we have the object. I showed a picture of myself with this, my copy of Willa Cather Living inscribed to Mary Virginia Altmelon. So yeah, I mean, I was basically, like I said, Lewis is either ignored or denigrated, and I was just kind of pissed off, right? I mean, that was basically let's assume she had a brain. She went to Smith after all. And that's really how it started. And then, it took me 18 years altogether. And there were a lot of challenges in there, but I think that the thing that really kept me going through to the end was when you get to the epilogue, if you read the book, y'all, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, I think she's the source of a lot of the nonsense that was disseminated in Cather's
That was one of the
scholarship.
things I was going to.
It's pretty terrible. And there was just, the first time I heard those words read aloud at a scholarly conference, I was just like, nope. I had already started on the research on Lewis, but I was just motivated to get through to say, no, that's just not, it's absolutely untrue in every particular. And I think Dorothy Canfield knew that.
And we can get to that back in a moment. I do want to make sure have you answer a question by Linda Norton, who says, thank you to both of us. Thank you, Linda. I'm curious as to whether Cather ever visited Smith with Lewis or without. Did it play any role in her writing?
She was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters in 1933 by Smith College. She was actually they first proposed it, I think, in 1929. Anyway, so she had deferred 1 year because she was already getting one from Princeton, but then she was invited, and that was the same year that Virginia Cather. So these are all the Smithies all over the book. Her sister and two of her nieces went to Smith, and it's pretty clear she helped pay for all of them to go to Smith. And one of Edith Lewis's nieces went to Smith, and she also helped to pay for that. So yes, she was there.
A lot of Smith here.
It's a lot of Smith. They're all over the place, let me tell you. And it actually is kind of at some point, whenever I ran into kind of an ordinary person name, like a female ordinary person name, and I was like, well, how am I going to find out who this person is? I would just Google them with Smith College, and I'd be like, oh, look, there she is. But yeah, so I think that certainly, so Willa Cather's sister, Elsie, started at the University of Nebraska in 1908. And after Cather had been living with Edith Lewis for 2 years, she, got her into Smith and paid for her to go to Smith. So I think that Cather recognized what Smith had to offer that was different from what she herself had gotten at the University of Nebraska. And she certainly valued it. And she knew a lot of Lewis's friends from Smith, from way back. She met Oxa very early on. So yeah, and I think my other favorite story that I found pretty late in the game is Charlotte Wilder, who was Thornton Wilder's sister, who was a poet. She was on the faculty at Smith for a couple of years, and she taught Virginia Cather, who graduated in 1933, who was Roscoe's elder daughter. And she wrote this letter to Edith Lewis after Willa Cather Living came out. She was like, I think I met you, didn't I? At 1933. And she recounts how Willa Cather was, on their way back from lunch. They went out to lunch with Virginia and with Charlotte Wilder and Willa and Edith, that Cather was discoursing on bullfighting in Hemingway and Marinay. On their way back, like they're walking back to Smith College from town, right? Talking about bullfighting scenes and literature.
Laura Marks says, as a Smithy from Lincoln who named her daughter Willa, I love that, Laura.
Woo!
I'm so excited about this book. Growing up in Nebraska, I had never heard of Edith Lewis, and it's wonderful you've restored her part of this story. That is just lovely. It's lovely to hear.
Give me a holler if you're ever coming to Lincoln, please. And she grew up. You'll find out more about this, but she grew up at 27th and N, before 27th Street was really a big developed thoroughfare. So.
And Sarah Howard is also a fellow Nebraska.
Oh, hey, Sarah.
And she said, such a great talk, Melissa. I'm curious about your thoughts on Edith Lewis's representation in Red Cloud at the Willa Cather Foundation Museum.
Okay, so when they did the big remo back in, I think it was 2017, maybe, when the new visitor center opened, they have a panel about Edith Lewis, and they ran it by me, and I rewrote everything because it was mostly erroneous, but they were committed to having a panel and representing that relationship. So I think that it's been a big change since I first visited Red Cloud in 1993 to go to a big Cather conference as a 30th birthday present for myself.
I love it.
So yes, but then on the other hand, though, and they actually, I volunteered myself, and we had a virtual event as a fundraiser talking about my book. That was my first virtual book event, was a fundraiser for the Cather Foundation, and they were very open to that. But on the other hand, Lewis is not really so much a part of the Red Cloud story, and a lot of the story there is about that community. Edith Lewis was there twice, once for several weeks in 1917. They were supposed to go abroad, but then the war and everything, they couldn't. And it was hard to get trained anywhere. So they spent 3 weeks there, and she was like shuttled around Red Cloud for 3 weeks from various places. And they were there for a couple of days in 1926 because Cather's father wanted her to stop by. He was having heart trouble, and that interrupted what was supposed to be a trip to the Grand Canyon. But so she's really not part of that story, and that's fine, right? I mean, it's okay that that place is about that local community, which she really didn't have a lot to do with. So.
Well, that is it for the questions that we've received tonight. And I think we have covered so much territory that we are fine with closing. And it's just been such a pleasure, Melissa, to talk to you further and more deeply about your book. I'm really, as your classmate, just so proud and honored to be able to take this time with you. And I'm delighted with everyone who's been helping us out tonight, but I want to let you be the one who closes things before we get to anything. Wait, more questions are coming in.
Okay, here we go.
Evangeline Heiliger, Vange.
Oh, Vange, hi Vange.
Just wants to say really enjoyed this. So thanks. And then Margaret Hunt, class of 73, says, thanks so much. I've really enjoyed this. So just really nice to get those bits of feedback from everyone. Thank you. But Melissa, I think you're definitely the one to have the last word.
Oh gosh, I don't even know. I don't know what to say. I've been doing so many virtual book events. So yes, I do want anyone who's still here who has not read the book to know that it is, I hope, an accessible book to non-academics, right? You've read it now, Bethanne, you can say that.
I can, absolutely.
Right.
And in fact, you know what? If you don't have things to say, that's what I will say to people is, the thank yous are rolling in from thanks, Elizabeth, Shelley, Liz, Go 85. This is great. But I can say that this is a work of scholarship that truly is accessible to the general reader. And I don't know anyone, I don't know if I know anyone who has not read any Willa Cather. I mean, most of us have read something, and even if it was, under high school duress. And if that's the case, you should probably go back and read some more Willa Cather, because
and I must say though, that if you have read Willa Cather, you will probably be motivated, but I did make a special point of cueing every discussion of a work by not presuming that anybody has actually read the work I'm about to talk about. So even if you don't know all of Willa Cather's works, I give cues and context so that you can follow what I'm saying. So you can enjoy it as a story of two people's lives without reading Willa Cather.
Exactly. And actually, here is a great question that came up from, there's so many, and I'm sorry, everyone, that we can't get to every single one of them right now, but someone asked Melissa if you could provide a non-Amazon link for the book.
Oh, I don't think I can. I don't think I can. Well, okay, so go to Melissa Homestead, allruntogether.com. And on the front page, you can click the link. And then there's also the card from Oxford University Press with a discount code. I don't think I can actually communicate in the chat with everybody. I don't think that works that way. So, but melissahomestead.com, right on the front page of my website, they will say, click the link to Oxford University Press and then put in the discount code.
And then you can buy it from OUP and not from Amazon. So
right, with a 30% discount. So there you go.
That's pretty sweet. So I think that's great. And I just want to say to everyone who is writing in with thanks that I'm sure these will be relayed to Melissa, even if we don't read every single one of them out. And it's just great to see so many classmates and fellow Smith alums here, but again, this is a book not just for Smithies, and it's not just for, you know, friends of Melissa or friends of Bethanne, it's for everyone. So go to melissahomestead.com and click that link to Oxford University Press. And no, I'm not shilling, I'm just encouraging.
I'm shilling. There you go.
And I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to say.
I think I'm good.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I just want to make sure that I go out correctly with the tech side of things. So if anyone over there wants to let me know what to do, otherwise I'll just say thank you. Thank you all for a wonderful evening. Thank you again, Melissa Homestead, author of The Only Wonderful Things, the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis. And join us next time, because I'm sure Melissa will have another book. So.
And this one took 18 years. I don't know.
Thanks again. Good night.